In 1990, the IRS seized everything Willie Nelson owned: his home, his recording studio, even his daughter's possessions. The government demanded $32 million from one of America's most beloved musicians. But what most fans don't know is that the full story is far darker and more complex than the headline suggested. Willie wasn't just fighting the IRS. He was battling corrupt accountants, receiving death threats, and living in his tour bus after losing everything. This is the dark truth about Willie Nelson's IRS nightmare, and how an outlaw country legend fought the most powerful collection agency in America, and somehow won. The road to Willie Nelson's tax nightmare wasn't paved with malicious intent, at least not on Willie's part. It was built on a foundation of bad advice, misplaced trust, and a fundamental disconnect between an artist and the complex world of tax law. In the early 1980s, Willie was making more money than he'd ever dreamed possible. His crossover success with albums like Stardust had transformed him from a country outlaw to a mainstream superstar. Concert promoters were paying him upwards of $100,000 per show, and he was performing over 200 nights a year. Album royalties were pouring in. Movie deals were happening. Willie Nelson had become not just a musician, but a brand. "I was making $10 to $12 million a year," Willie later admitted in his autobiography. "More money than I thought there was in the whole world." But there was a problem. The IRS wanted their cut, roughly 70% in those days, for someone in Willie's tax bracket. That's when Price Waterhouse, one of the most prestigious accounting firms in America, presented a solution that seemed too good to be true. And as the saying goes, it was. The firm recommended Willie invest in tax shelters, specifically a complex cattle breeding operation and a series of other investments designed to generate paper losses. These losses would offset his massive income, dramatically reducing his tax burden. Willie, who grew up poor in Abbott, Texas, and had no financial education, trusted the experts. "I remember them telling me, 'We're going to take care of you,'" Willie later recalled, "and I believed them." What his accountants didn't tell him was that the IRS had already begun aggressively targeting these exact types of tax shelters. In 1981, the same year Willie was diving deeper into these investments, the IRS had created a special division specifically to crack down on abusive tax shelters. While Willie was on the road, playing his guitar and singing his songs, the IRS was building a case against the very tax strategy his accountants had recommended. And Willie, focused on his music and charitable work like Farm Aid, remained completely unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. By 1984, the first warning signs appeared. The IRS disallowed some of Willie's deductions from previous years. His accountants assured him they could handle it. They were wrong. What started as a manageable problem was about to spiral into a catastrophe that would threaten everything Willie had built. And as the calendar turned to 1990, Willie Nelson was about to discover just how serious the government was about collecting what they believed they were owed. The first real indication that Willie Nelson was in serious trouble came in 1984. The IRS sent notice that they were disallowing tax shelters from his returns dating back to 1975. Initially, the tax bill was around $6 million, but that was just the beginning. As penalties and interest accumulated, the amount eventually ballooned to a staggering $32 million. "I had a bunch of guys who said, 'Don't worry about it, we'll take care of it,'" Willie later explained in interviews, "and I believed them. That was my mistake." By 1988, the situation had deteriorated significantly. The IRS was no longer interested in negotiations. They wanted their money, and they were prepared to take drastic action to get it. Willie, still not fully grasping the severity of his situation, continued touring and recording, believing his financial team would eventually sort things out. What made Willie's case particularly complex was that he wasn't just dealing with the IRS. The tax shelters his accountants had recommended involved multiple investors. When these shelters were declared invalid, those investors lost millions. Some blamed Willie personally, not understanding that he was as much a victim of bad advice as they were. In late 1989, Willie received a phone call that would change everything. His financial manager finally admitted the truth. Negotiations with the IRS had failed completely. The government was preparing to seize his assets. All of them. "I remember exactly where I was standing when I got that call," Willie wrote in his memoir. "I was in my house in Spicewood, looking out at the golf course I'd built, the place I thought I'd live forever. And just like that, I knew it was all about to be taken away. On November 9th, 1990, agents from the Internal Revenue Service arrived at Willie's beloved 44-acre ranch in Spicewood, Texas. What happened next would shock music fans across America and begin one of the most unusual chapters in the history of tax collection. On that cold November morning in 1990, IRS agents descended on Willie Nelson's Pedernales Country Club and Ranch in Spicewood, Texas. Armed with court orders and accompanied by U.S. Marshals, they began the largest seizure of personal property in IRS history. The 44-acre property, with its recording studio, golf course, and swimming pool, was just the beginning. The agents went room by room through Willie's home, cataloging and tagging everything of value. His platinum records were removed from the walls. His collection of Native American artifacts was boxed up. Even family photos were inventoried. Perhaps most painfully, they took Trigger, Willie's beloved Martin N20 classical guitar, an instrument so important to him that he once rushed into a burning house to save it. Only through the quick thinking of his daughter, Lana, who managed to smuggle Trigger out before the agents arrived, was the guitar spared from the auction block. "They took everything," Willie later recalled. "They even took my daughter's possessions. They took stuff that wasn't even mine." The raid didn't stop at his Texas ranch. IRS agents also seized his property in Ridgetop, Tennessee, his condo in Hawaii, and several other real estate holdings. In total, they confiscated nearly 20 properties and countless personal items. News of the seizure spread quickly. Fans were shocked to see one of America's most beloved musicians brought so low. The IRS announced plans to auction off Willie's possessions to the highest bidders. His life's work and personal treasures would be sold piece by piece to strangers. For Willie, the emotional toll was immense. At 57 years old, he had lost nearly everything he had worked for throughout his life. With no home to return to, Willie's tour bus became his primary residence. But even as the IRS was dismantling his life, Willie Nelson was already thinking about how to fight back, and his response would prove to be as creative and unconventional as the man himself. In the wake of the IRS seizures, Willie Nelson found himself in a situation that would have broken many people. At 57 years old, he was essentially homeless, with his tour bus serving as his only reliable shelter. The man who had written "My Heroes Have Always Been Cowboys" was now living the hardscrabble life of his musical heroes, albeit under very different circumstances. "I was broke, but I wasn't broken," Willie later said. "There's a big difference." The public humiliation was intense. Late-night comedians made jokes at his expense. News programs ran stories about his financial downfall. Some critics suggested he had deliberately evaded taxes, not understanding that Willie had followed professional advice from accountants he trusted. What few people knew at the time was that Willie was also receiving death threats. Some investors who had followed him into the tax shelters had lost millions when the IRS declared those shelters invalid. They blamed Willie personally, not realizing he was as much a victim as they were. Despite these challenges, Willie maintained his grueling tour schedule, sometimes performing 250 shows per year. Every dollar he earned went toward his massive tax debt, but at the rate he was going, it would take decades to pay off $32 million. Yet through it all, Willie maintained his characteristic calm and good humor. When asked by reporters how he felt about his situation, he often responded with jokes. "What's the difference between an IRS agent and a whore?" he would ask. "A whore will stop screwing you when you're dead." What Willie needed was a creative solution, a way to turn this disaster into an opportunity. And in early 1991, inspiration struck in the form of an unusual album concept that would become one of the most unique recordings in country music history. In early 1991, Willie Nelson had a brilliant idea. If the IRS wanted his money, he'd give them his music. He approached the agency with an unprecedented proposal. He would record an album specifically to pay off his tax debt. The album would be sold directly through phone orders, with the proceeds going straight to the IRS. Surprisingly, the IRS agreed. They even allowed Willie to use the seized recording studio at his Pedernales ranch to make the album. In a twist of irony, Willie was recording in his own studio that he no longer owned, to create music that would help him buy back his freedom. The result was the IRS tapes, "Who'll Buy My Memories?" a stripped-down acoustic album featuring just Willie and his guitar trigger. No band, no production tricks, just raw, intimate performances of some of his most personal songs. The album's title was a clever play on his situation. His memories, in the form of his possessions, were literally being sold off by the government. The album was sold for $19.95 through a special 800 number advertised on a series of infomercials. In these late-night TV spots, Willie candidly discussed his tax troubles and pitched the album directly to viewers. It was marketing genius, turning his public humiliation into a selling point. For each album sold, about $6 went directly to the IRS. While the IRS tapes didn't sell enough copies to completely solve Willie's problems, it did raise several $1,000,000 and, more importantly, change the narrative. Willie was no longer just a tax delinquent. He was a creative problem solver using his art to fight back against overwhelming odds. But even as Willie was recording his way out of trouble, something remarkable was happening behind the scenes. Friends and fans were quietly organizing to save the treasures of his life from being scattered forever. When the IRS announced plans to auction off Willie Nelson's possessions, they didn't anticipate the loyalty of his friends and fans. As the auction dates approached, a secret network of supporters mobilized with a simple mission: buy Willie's treasures and return them to him later. The first auction was held in February 1991 at Willie's Pedernales Country Club in Spicewood, Texas. Hundreds of people gathered as the IRS put his personal items on the block, everything from gold records to clothing, furniture to memorabilia. But mixed among the curious onlookers were Willie's friends, strategically positioned throughout the crowd. One of those friends was Darrell Royal, the legendary University of Texas football coach. Royal quietly purchased several of Willie's platinum records and personal mementos. His plan was simple: buy them now, give them back to Willie later. "I wasn't going to let strangers walk away with Willie's life," Royal later explained. "Those things belonged with him." Another ally was Willie's daughter, Lana, who had already saved his beloved guitar trigger from seizure. She attended multiple auctions, bidding on family photos and personal items that held sentimental value. Perhaps the most dramatic rescue came when Willie's Pedernales Country Club itself went up for auction. A group of investors led by Willie's friend Darrell Royal pooled their resources to purchase the property. Their intention was to hold it until Willie could buy it back, which he eventually did. These secret allies never sought recognition for their actions. Many of their efforts remained unknown to the public for years. They acted out of loyalty to a man whose music had touched their lives, whose generosity was legendary, and who now needed help in his darkest hour. While these friends were working behind the scenes to preserve pieces of Willie's past, the man himself was focused on rebuilding his future and negotiating a final settlement with the IRS. By 1992, Willie Nelson had been battling the IRS for nearly a decade. The seizures, auctions, and public humiliation had taken their toll, but they had also generated unexpected sympathy for the country legend. The image of the government stripping everything from a beloved American artist didn't sit well with the public. This shift in public opinion gave Willie leverage in his ongoing negotiations with the IRS. His attorney, Jay Goldberg, used this to their advantage, arguing that the government's heavy-handed approach was counterproductive. If they wanted to collect the maximum amount possible, they needed Willie to keep performing and recording, not fighting legal battles. In a surprising turn of events, the IRS agreed to a settlement that was unprecedented in tax collection history. In '93, they accepted $9 million to satisfy Willie's $32 million debt, a reduction of more than 70%. This included the money already raised through auctions and the IRS tapes album. The settlement included another unusual provision. Willie would share future revenue from a lawsuit against Price Waterhouse, the accounting firm that had recommended the disastrous tax shelters in the first place. This acknowledged what Willie had maintained all along, that he had followed professional advice in good faith. "I think they finally realized I wasn't trying to get away with anything," Willie later said. "I was just following what my accountants told me to do." The settlement allowed Willie to begin rebuilding his life. He was 60 years old and essentially starting over financially, but he was free from the crushing weight of an impossible debt. He could now focus on what he did best: making music. For Willie, the experience reinforced what had always been his philosophy: that material possessions were ultimately less important than freedom, creativity, and human connections. As he put it in his memoir, I learned that money, possessions, and tax problems come and go, but music, friends, and family are forever. In the years following his settlement with the IRS, Willie Nelson experienced a remarkable career renaissance. Rather than being defined by his tax troubles, he emerged from the ordeal with his reputation not just intact, but enhanced. The public saw him as a fighter who had taken on the system and, in his own way, won. Willie's response to financial disaster became part of his legend, another chapter in the story of a true American outlaw. His resilience in the face of overwhelming odds resonated with fans who had faced their own struggles. If Willie Nelson could lose everything at age 57 and bounce back, maybe they could overcome their challenges too. The experience fundamentally changed Willie's relationship with money and possessions. Always generous, he became even more detached from material wealth. "I realized I didn't need all that stuff," he later reflected. "What was important was still with me, my family, my music, my guitar." This philosophy manifested in his lifestyle choices. Though he eventually purchased another ranch in Texas, he continued to spend much of his time on his tour bus, Honeysuckle Rose. The man who once owned multiple homes across the country seemed most at home on the road. The tax ordeal also influenced Willie's music. Albums like Across the Borderline, 1993, and Spirit, 1996, contained some of his most reflective work, with themes of perseverance, redemption, and the passing of time. Perhaps most significantly, the experience deepened Willie's commitment to helping others. Having faced financial ruin himself, he became even more dedicated to causes like Farm Aid, which he had co-founded in 1985 to assist struggling family farmers. Today, Willie Nelson's tax troubles are just one chapter in his remarkable life story, a testament to his resilience, creativity, and unwavering spirit. The outlaw who sang about freedom found a way to reclaim his own, even when faced with the most powerful collection agency in America. Willie Nelson's battle with the IRS represents more than just a celebrity tax case. It's a uniquely American story about resilience, creativity, and redemption. When faced with a $32 million tax bill that would have crushed most people, Willie didn't run, hide, or give up. Instead, he faced his troubles head-on, with the same authenticity that had defined his music for decades. The story contains all the elements of classic Willie Nelson songwriting: hardship, humor, friendship, and ultimately triumph against the odds. It's a tale that resonates because it reflects values that Americans hold dear: standing up to overwhelming power, finding innovative solutions to seemingly impossible problems, and maintaining dignity even in the darkest moments. What makes Willie's tax saga particularly compelling is how it revealed his character. When his possessions were being auctioned off, he didn't become bitter or resentful. Instead, he joked about his situation and focused on moving forward. When he needed to raise money, he didn't beg for charity. He created something new and valuable with the IRS tapes. Today, at 90 years old, Willie Nelson continues to tour, record, and inspire new generations of musicians and fans. His tax troubles, once front-page news, have become just another colorful chapter in his extraordinary life story. Perhaps the most powerful lesson from Willie's IRS battle is that our lowest moments don't have to define us. With creativity, perseverance, and a little help from our friends, even the most overwhelming challenges can be overcome. The outlaw who sang about freedom found himself completely at the mercy of the government, and then found his way back to freedom again on his own terms.